Brown had just finished reading a book about a powerful witch at Red's home. And Brown was extremely excited as he read about the magic she possessed together with the poisonous potions that she crafted. Then suddenly, Red remembered a story told by his mom about a woman who lived in a forest far to the west of town. Red became frightened as he recalled his mother's words saying that she looked a lot like a witch and she loved to turn spoiled little children into rats and put them in a little cage in and around her house. Brown said that she was just a crazy beggar and that he'd seen her before begging for money in the park. Pink stood by with an expression of awe as she was listening to her friends talking about the old lady. To her, that old lady was just an eccentric old woman who rarely speaks with anyone. Then, as if Pink just thought of an idea, she excitedly jumped up and suggested that 3 of them should go to the old woman's house to find out what was really going on and get to the bottom of this mystery. At first, they were a little bit scared and worried, wondering if they should go to the house or not. But everyone was curious, and they all agreed to go there together. The 3 friends nervously followed the path into the forest, which led to the woman's house. The closer they walked to it, the more visible it became. From the outside, the house didn't look much like the one in the book that Brown had read before. The house was mostly made of ebony. It looked quite small. On the outside, it was gloomy and silent. But inside, you could see many candles lit, and the flickering of lights were shining through the windows onto the white snow. Red carefully sneaked to the side of the house. He saw a window in the back and then made plans for Brown and Pink to join him. Because the windows were so high, Red motioned to Brown to get down on all 4s to lift him up first. Both Pink and Brown were curious to know what that old woman was doing inside. As Brown lifted him up, Red looked inside the house and saw a rather small but old woman with a plump body sitting in a chair with her back turned towards him. Red could hear the old woman chewing. It looked like she was eating something. Since Red could only see her from behind, he couldn't tell what she looked like and what she was actually doing. Suddenly, a mosquito came to sit on Brown's nose as he was helping lift Red up. He couldn't kill it. It flew up his nose, and it made him sneeze loudly. Red's loud sneeze broke the silence. The old woman suddenly got up and turned toward the window. Now, Red was speechless, overwhelmed with fear. At that moment, the image of the old woman was clearly visible. She was halfway undressed, revealing her large belly. Right inside her abdominal cavity lurked an unusual, monstrous, human-like head. This creepy old lady was feeding rats to that whatever kind of creepy creature was growing out of her stomach, and it had sharp teeth and a creepy long tongue fluttering in front of her stomach. As he looked closely at her stomach, he quickly realized it was a wicked, demonic face. It looked like a parasitic demon living on the woman's stomach. Oh, it was sinking its teeth into the rats, swallowing them as the crimson blood spilled all over the floor, creating a disgusting sight. Red gagged, trying to hold back the nausea, but then fell backwards into Brown and Pink's confusing faces. Red screamed out that she was a witch and ran like crazy, as Brown and Pink had no idea what was going on. They just confusingly looked at each other. However, just about the time when Brown was taking Pink's hand to run away, he saw Pink looking terrified, realizing that the old woman stood by the window looking straight at Pink. By now, the two of them were so petrified that they couldn't run at all. They were frozen with fear. From her abdomen, a monster with a wide mouth jumped out, rushing towards Pink, swallowing her whole body in the blink of an eye. Brown screamed in horror and ran away. He ran all the way to the main street and then passed out. Later, he was found by a passerby and taken to the hospital. But the horror story didn't stop there. According to his description, the sheriff went to find the old woman's house, but there was no trace of her existence. Red and Pink were reported missing, and the people in town assumed that the three kids had gone into the forest and went missing. Later, the police found some pieces of Pink's clothing. They assumed that both Pink and Red, quite possibly, were eaten by wild animals. To get more ideas about my horror novel about witchcraft from this story, which was also previously told by a priest, I decided to meet Mr. Brown at a small monastery. Aside from this crazy story, Mr. Brown also told me about a thrilling detail. The monster that was raised in front of the old woman's belly was actually her son. Not only that, when I asked about the address of that house in the woods, Mr. Brown enthusiastically showed me, but just as I was about to leave, he warned me that if I intended to ever go there, I had to be careful for my life because there were traps set everywhere. Hello, I'm Alva. I'm a marine biologist, and I just got transferred to the Virgin Islands Institute of Oceanographic Studies. Mattis, one of my new colleagues, was arguably the team's weirdest scientist. He was extremely clumsy, a total loner, often grumpy, and very rarely interacted with anyone. As researchers, we're used to working alone, but Mattis certainly wasn't a team player. He wouldn't tell anyone about his progress or results. I used to think he was a simple, normal guy, but I accidentally discovered his secret, and it definitely changed my mind about him. That day, the director of the Research Institute had asked me to bring a folder to Mattis's room. His room was separate from everyone else's, and very few people from the Institute had any chance to visit with him. And for this reason, most researchers would call it the mysterious chamber. When I got there, I knocked on the door several times, but nobody answered me. Since I was in a hurry, I had no other choice but to open the door with the intention of simply leaving the folder on the table and quickly going out. But the scene that awaited me behind the door instantly made me weak in the knees, and my legs began shaking uncontrollably. The atmosphere in Mattis's office was sinister and gloomy. It's true that scientists are free to decorate their room as they wish to, but the layout and decor were really bizarre. The whole room had been painted black, and the dim lighting was a dark red. After getting used to the darkness, and as I looked around, I saw that an unusual skeleton was set against the wall. Its upper body was very much like a human skeleton. but its lower body looked like a fishtail. Had it once been a living creature, or was it one of Mattis's monstrous creations? This definitely piqued my curiosity, and I decided to get closer in order to touch the fish bones of the tail. But in the obscurity, my hand mistakenly pushed a lever next to the creature, thereby opening a secret door that led to a downward tunnel, and I couldn't help but enter to see where it went. I quickly reached a research lab built at sea level. It contained a large aquarium filled with what looked like sharks, and I assumed this was where Mattis got most of his research done. The smell was strong, ammonia-like, and my eyes stung. The walls were made of transparent glass, but strangely, the water inside was pitch black. I really couldn't see much until suddenly a large fishtail slowly started undulating in front of me from behind the aquarium wall. I managed to turn on a lamp set high above my head, but as I looked again in front of me, I jerked back in horror. The tail was, in fact, a mermaid. Was I dreaming? Was it, in fact, alive and real? I put my hands in front of the mouth so as not to make a sound, but the poor creature was tied up with 2 large chains and seemed to be in so much pain. The chains seemed to be lightly electrified. By chance, I quickly identified the generator outside of the aquarium and disconnected it immediately. The mermaid then managed to free herself from the chains that were tying her hips, and she instinctively dashed towards me while growling fiercely. I was so scared by the scene I was witnessing that sweat started streaming down my temples and forehead. As I removed my glasses to wipe off the sweat, I clumsily dropped them on the floor. I got on my knees right away and started searching for them frantically until my right hand touched someone's leg. I immediately heard Mattis's voice, and as I put on my glasses, which I'd finally recovered, I looked up and saw him holding an axe about ready to cut my head off. As he was swinging at me, I dodged each hit by rolling to the side, but Mattis quickly picked up the axe again and tried cracking my skull a second time. All I could think of was that my end was near, and I was ready to die then and there. But in a stroke of genius, I suddenly remembered the sharks and the sound generator that I just developed and was keeping in my pocket. I hurriedly shoved my hands in my lab coat, took out the sonic device, and turned the ring to the maximum level. A few seconds later, the sharks went absolutely insane. They began punching their heads violently into the glass walls and managed to break the aquarium open. As they slid out of the water onto the lab floor, a first whale tore off Mattis's left arm, followed by a second shark that bit off a large chunk of his torso. Blood was gushing out of his arteries and started painting the floor red, but water was oozing out of all sides too. In less than a couple minutes, the lab had become an aquarium, and I was getting weaker and weaker, fighting the rising waters. I struggled looking for a way out and felt that I was about to drown when a mermaid suddenly appeared before my eyes and dragged me away. Lucky guy, huh? When I woke up, I found myself safely lying on a hospital bed, convinced that the mermaid had saved me. I sincerely hope she returned peacefully and freely where she belongs, in the wild blue ocean. I told this story to my friends and was met with a lot of skepticism. They believe that I was probably saved by dolphins and that I mistook them for the mermaid. Anyway, regardless of what happened, I'm still haunted by this story, and I still work at the Institute, and I'm passionate about what I do. But I'll never look at the ocean the same way again. And I'll always be reminded of that mermaid every time I eat a meal of fish sticks. Here's a story that took place about 2 years ago, when I was a famous plastic surgeon at a prestigious hospital in Gangnam. I myself didn't pay much attention to my reputation, as I was more into caring about the artificial beauty that I could bring to my customers. Never had I thought of myself to be able to perform plastic surgery on a dead person until I encountered this monstrous situation. That day, the director of orthopedic surgery asked me to replace him on one of his night shifts, as he had to settle some family affairs. Having worked all day, I was no longer in the mood to be on duty that night. My head was dizzy, I was tired and stressed, but I just felt compelled and obligated to help him out. It was now around midnight, and I was exhausted. I tried to get back to my room to take a short rest after a long day of surgery. I slowly took off my shirt, yawning and sighing, sleepy, when I suddenly heard an echoing sound, loud, and then it went completely quiet. I thought that maybe it was because I was too tired, that I began to imagine things, or just simply misheard it. As I was about to go to bed, I heard that sound again. I curiously went to the door to see what it was. There was not a single person in sight. The whole corridor was mostly dim, as the light was only shining in a small place. I began feeling worried, as the dark, cold air made me feel like I was in a morgue. Suddenly, I saw a glimpse of a figure standing at the end of the hallway. She stood there for a while without moving, and the clothes she wore looked like a patient's, so I kept wondering what she was doing there. I heard her call out my name. "Doctor, hey, Jin, please follow me." I looked at her confusingly, not understanding what to do or say. This was awkward, and suddenly an invisible hand pulled me towards her. I was so filled with horror that I was completely paralyzed and couldn't even scream out. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't control my actions. I finally stopped in front of the computer engineering room, and when I entered, the door unexpectedly slammed shut and startled me. There was that woman still standing in front of me, not saying a word. A stream of consciousness began filling my mind, making me tremble and break into a cold sweat. My legs were no longer able to stand on their own. I had to lean against a nearby chair or wall. And the scene that followed after that proved that my thinking was absolutely correct. She suddenly burst into tears. Her cry resounded frighteningly, giving me goosebumps all over. And then she stared at me. My face was completely pale, as there was no blood left in it. My limbs were exhausted, and I couldn't feel any life in them. Even though I tried to scream, I could not make a single sound. All of a sudden, the computer screen automatically turned on, continuously changing page to page, as if it was being controlled by some spirit that I couldn't see. But then it stopped. A list of hospital clients appeared on the screen, with a line of text colored in red. It was the name of a client that I had performed plastic surgery on about 2 months ago. I've never seen her again. I glanced fearfully at the female ghost, and then she suddenly lifted her hair and looked at me as if she were pleading for help. Seeing her crushed, bloody face, eyes popping out, made me so scared, terrified, that I didn't even dare to look at her any longer. Maybe she was going to turn me into some statue or something. She suddenly whispered, Please help me to have a beautiful face. This didn't make any sense. She was a ghost. After a while, I understood what she wanted. Although I didn't want to, I reluctantly accepted her offer to help. The next day, I returned home and went to the morgue she had told me about before. It was explained to me by the morgue manager that she had died 2 days ago due to a serious traffic accident. Her entire face was completely deformed, and she could not be identified. Thinking only of her wishes, I agreed to do that, but I was really afraid. After completing the procedure, I quickly took her body to the hospital. Faced with a corpse that was both terrifyingly disgusting and filled with stench, deeply worried me. I also had to deal with the after effects from the hospital. I knew they were going to put an enormous amount of pressure on me. Maybe I wasn't fit in their eyes to continue working. Anyway, I was very worried. But thanks to my determination, my skills and experience made for a successful surgery and the most beautiful corpse I'd ever seen. I began to patch up the crushed flesh on her face, adding some silicone, injecting some filler, and eventually getting her face looking as natural and harmonious as possible. Though it looked a bit scary, I subtly used makeup to conceal her flaws. Looking at the finished production, or looking at the finished product in front of me, I shivered in fear again. But I was also happy to have been able to fulfill a dying girl's wish. In my opinion, every woman, alive or dead, wants to be beautiful. I just hope I never run into another ghost again. Have you ever heard of the custom of organizing ghost weddings for the dead? I am Bora, a researcher living in America. In 1990, I took a trip to a remote rural area in China to do scientific research on the spiritual culture and beliefs of the ethnic minorities there. That place was a small village in Shaanxi Province, China. To facilitate my travel, I hired Apeng, an experienced local guide, who was there to assist me along the journey. To enter this village, we had to go through places with rugged terrain, where vehicles could go no further. We had to walk the rest of the way, about 3 kilometers of forest roads. As we arrived at the village, it was already late afternoon. Apeng took me to a strange home, where I would stay in the village. After the introductions, Apeng had to return back to his hometown. Upon arrival, I saw houses that were built of stone, wooden pillars, and thatched roofs. Inside the house, the gray, moldy walls were overgrown with moss and lichens. There was absolutely no electric light, only the glow of a kerosene lamp. There was an old couple there to welcome me. They were very kind and cooked a lot of delicious local specialties for me. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to go to the toilet. with only the glimmering light of the dimly lit kerosene lamp to guide me through this cold, dark, scary place. I sensed that something was about to happen. That feeling grew even more intense when I began my journey outside to the toilet, about 50 meters away from the house. To make it easier, I opened my backpack and took out the torch that I had brought with me. It was super dark outside, surrounded by the sound of insects. After walking for a while, I must have been caught by some kind of a noose or snare around my feet. I was suddenly hanging upside down from a tree by a rope bound around my ankles and feet. Looking down, I saw a strange couple standing on the ground, looking up at me with their cold, sharp eyes. They were talking to each other in a strange language that was unfamiliar to me. I couldn't hear them clearly. Next, I saw the old lady walking toward the rope that I was hanging from in the tree. She pulled out a knife and severed the rope. After falling to the ground, the only thing I could remember was that I was very dizzy. But before I was able to collect my senses, the old man suddenly rushed over to me, striking me on the head with some object like a heavy stick. The next time I woke up, my surroundings were dark. There was a strong smell of tar, wood, and tea. I panicked when I realized I was lying in a wooden coffin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat, as if I had been paralyzed by the shock of what was happening. I tried to open the coffin by hitting it with all my strength, but my limbs were weak and stiff with the heaviness caused by the trauma. Lying inside the coffin, I heard people outside. They were talking and chattering. They seemed to be busy organizing something. However, due to my limited understanding of my Chinese knowledge, I was not able to understand what they were saying. A moment later, the coffin lid was opened, and two muscular young men pulled me up. Under the weak yellow light, I could see the house and the coffin itself. From where I was lying, I saw strange decorations made of red silk ribbons. They were hanging everywhere, forming large bunches of flowers. I was being dragged in front of this couple. It was so surprising to see that behind the couple's seat was an altar with incense, lamps, and fruit. In the middle of the back wall was the word Shunxi, which meant double happiness. I was startled to see myself wearing a Chinese groom's costume. Looking up, my heart felt a strange sense, as if someone had been suffocated. I saw a girl in a bride's dress, with a red scarf covering her face, situated next to the old couple. The girl's hands were loose. Her head was tilted to the side. Behind her were wooden splints, holding her body up. It appeared as if she was still alive, seated in an upright position. It was then that I realized she must be dead, more terrified. The corpse and I were pulled out in front of the old couple. A big fat matchmaker was continuously saying something I couldn't understand. Then she held my head down to perform the ritual. If I was not mistaken, this was a Chinese wedding ceremony. The people there were surrounding me, all of them with the same cold, scary faces. At that time, I could do nothing but follow. Perhaps they had given me some kind of drug mixed in with my drink, which caused me to completely lose all my strength. After that, the corpse and I were taken back to the coffin. It was a large coffin, big enough for 2 people. And then, the coffin lid was slowly closed, followed by the sound of nails being hammered into the coffin lid. In an effort to securely close the coffin, these people seemed inhumane and cold. As the smell of the rotting corpse was rising, I felt stuffy and began to feel a cold sweat breaking out. Then, even more terrifying, the headscarf slipped and revealed the pale face of the girl's corpse. Apparently, the corpse opened its eyes and glared at me. Oh my God, my heart froze. I could see that there was still blood remaining in the eyes of that corpse. I tried to make my body flutter with the intention of escaping, but my whole body went limp and soft, without any strength. Meanwhile, the coffin was being lifted and carried to a place, then lowered into a deep pit. I heard the frightening noise of the shovels, as I could clearly feel the shoveling of dirt on my head. I was about to be buried alive, here alongside the corpse of the dead girl. I was traumatized by all these terrible things that were happening to me. But then, at that very moment, I heard the screams of a group of people, and I realized that one of them was Apeng's voice. In that moment of suspense, I saw the coffin lid open. It was Apeng and 2 other local police officers. Fortunately, they arrived just in time to free me. Apeng said that because he forgot his belongings, he came back to retrieve them. When he found out about this scary incident, he ran down to the town and reported it to the local police. But it took a while for them to arrive because it was difficult to navigate through the rough terrain. But thankfully, they made it just in time. After returning to the United States, I began to learn about the ancient Chinese ghost wedding customs. The event was so extremely frightening for me. The custom of this Chinese marriage ritual is still practiced in the same way, and customs of this dark ritual, even up to this very day. Last summer, due to my father's bad health, I had to give up my summer plans in order to return to my hometown to help out on the family farm. It was the harvest season. Farm work never stops for vacation. It's a 7-day-a-week job, 365 days a year from sunup to sundown. Next to our family farm was another larger farm owned by Mr. Donald. He's a very kind man, but his son Dennis had been in and out of jail many times, charged with robbery, drugs, you name it, he's probably involved. When I got home, I found out that Dennis had been released from prison recently. Upon hearing about this, many local people were surprised and uncomfortable, wondering what to expect. Mr. Donald's wife just passed away last year, but he soon found comfort in the company of his newfound canine companion, Friss, a bulldog with short hair, very alert, very smart, and extremely loyal. He and his new companion bonded quickly. They both brought so much comfort and happiness to each other's daily lives. However, Dennis didn't like dogs at all, and he especially developed a hatred toward Friss, and I think Friss felt the same way about him. Whenever he laid his eyes on Friss, he would immediately run after him, and upon capture, Dennis would violently beat him. It's no wonder why, every time Dennis saw Friss, the dog would run away to a secure hiding place, trying to avoid another beating. That poor innocent dog never dared to show himself when that bully Dennis was anywhere nearby. After getting out of prison, Dennis, unfazed by prison life, continued his old, evil, violent ways, plunging himself right back into the same addictive lifestyle, gambling, drugs, burglary, refusing to get a job. He was constantly asking Mr. Donald for money. But when things didn't go his way, He'd just steal whatever money he wanted from his father. Mr. Donald grew very upset and extremely unhappy. Dennis and his father quarreled all the time. Mr. Donald was about to face yet another tragic event. A gang of violent thieves showed up at Mr. Donald's home on the farm, their faces covered with a black veil that only revealed their eyes. They forced their way inside, carrying many weapons, including knives and guns. Friss, his loyal companion, began to bark loudly and viciously from the ground floor, waking Mr. Donald from his bedroom upstairs. Mr. Donald reached for his robe, went downstairs to check what was going on. But when he saw the scene unfolding in front of him, it just left him terrified and speechless. Fearing that these thugs might have been exposed, the robbers surrounded Mr. Donald in the middle of the house with pointed guns aimed at him. Suddenly, out of desperation, he attacked one of those thieving creeps that was standing in front of him. But the rage that overcame those punks took a violent turn as one of them put a bullet in his back. He instantly went into shock, falling to the floor from the intense pain. But before he closed his eyes, he witnessed yet another dark ritual about to take place. His poor dog, Friss, seeing his master being beaten and shot, bravely rushed into action, fiercely attacking and biting one of them, and taking a big chunk of flesh out of that bandit's legs, ripping it with such aggressive force that it tore a hole in his trousers. The bandit who was bitten clutched his leg in pain, his evil eyes filled with rage and cruelty, clenching his teeth. He pointed his gun at Friss and fired multiple times at him. Friss curled his painful body into a fetal position on the floor. He took one last breath and stopped breathing. Suddenly, he heard an amusing laughter in the distance, sounding familiar to him. Mr. Donald tried to raise his eyes one last time to look at the man who shot his dog, knowing who that person was that committed these inhuman acts. Taking one last breath, he then slipped into death, falling into an abyss of darkness as everything went pitch black. A week later, while watching a movie, Dennis suddenly heard a growl outside his door. He angrily looked around to see if there was another dog running into the house. Being traumatized, he held a gun in his hand with the intention of shooting to death whatever creature was lurking in the darkness. But when he opened the door, searching for vengeance, a dog-like figure with bloodshot eyes and drooling foam about the mouth, it was growling at Dennis when suddenly it lunged at him, causing him to fall backwards. That devil ghost dog began violently sinking his fang-like teeth deep into the flesh surrounding Dennis's neck, slurping his blood before slowly vanishing. Gradually, Dennis was becoming more and more mentally unstable, always tense in a state of unease, thinking that Friss had returned from the grave to exact his revenge. More frightening, the people in town often found Dennis crawling on all fours, his eyes glowing with a deep crimson red, making strange vocalizations, snarling, growling, and foaming at the mouth. You could see the foam dripping from him like a rabid hound dog, like the beast that was now in possession of his soul. As the days passed, he was behaving like someone who had totally lost his mind and all his humanity, fading in and out of consciousness, crawling through the streets, digging through trash cans for food. Soon after, a stranger appeared in town. He was an evil soul, just like Dennis. He hated almost all animals, especially dogs. He loved to torture them and beat them to death, when he saw Dennis, who had now morphed into some kind of unknown creature. Ironically, that same man set a trap and baited it with food, hoping to catch the creature that was once Dennis. After his trophy catch, he responded with the same kind of brutality that once dominated Dennis, inflicting the same kind of lust for torture. After taking the life of that creature, Dennis, the man was never seen again. Rumors about him kept spreading, all claiming that Dennis was bitten by some satanic creature that resembled an unusual dog-like beast that had returned from the bowels of the deep, dark underworld of hell to avenge his evil ways. Many people believe that his death was the price he had to pay for the sins that he'd committed to all the animals and people who once loved him. A few days after the incident happened, the police found out the truth. No one could have imagined that Donald's only son Dennis was the mastermind behind the robberies that cruelly killed his beloved dog, Friss. I've been witness to what happens to people who commit such evil deeds. Dennis had opened a door, inviting the dark souls to enter from the world below. Dennis had passed through a dark place where he unknowingly became infested by the dark souls of demonic possession. Hello, my name's Alan. I recently graduated from college and currently work for a real estate company. I have a close friend whose name is Dana, who used to be a colleague, albeit as a receptionist. But she left the company a few months ago, and I haven't seen her much ever since. Dana has changed jobs quite often throughout her career. It seems she can't stick to the same job or company for very long. In fact, her record is of 3 months. And her latest venture was to become a full-time food YouTuber. Now, competition is extremely fierce in that field, and it certainly requires hard work, dedication, and stamina. After all, anyone can record food videos and upload them on YouTube. But in order to go viral quickly and be truly buzzworthy, one must offer videos featuring compelling and unique content. Fully aware of the likes and wants of the online community, Dana decided on a highly daring strategy to attract the attention of viewers. Quite a few detractors deemed Dana's channel to be too disturbing and revolting, but she insisted on eating what are considered to be horrific foods. These included snakes, giant centipedes, live eels, pig brains, fertilized duck eggs, various insects, and any unorthodox suggestion made by the audience in the comment threads. Dana's videos immediately attracted hundreds of thousands of viewers, while subscriptions to her channel skyrocketed. Dana became famous almost overnight. People everywhere presented her as the latest YouTube phenomenon, and quite a few television channels even featured her in their headlines. Fully committed to her new job and passion, Dana entirely separated herself from the outside world, including her friends and family. As such, I didn't see her very often anymore. All I can remember is the last time we met. She looked really distraught and drained. This had me worried. So, after that last encounter, I suggested quite a few times that we go out for dinner. But each time, she turned me down or canceled at the last minute. In the end, the only way I could see Dana was on the live stream. One day, as usual, my phone received the notification for her latest video. After clicking on the link, I saw my friend showing and playing with live octopuses. They were resting on a plate next to a cup of hot mustard, so I figured that Dana might eat these sea creatures alive. After sitting methodically in front of the camera, Dana greeted her audience as usual and proceeded to start her meal. She looked even worse than when I'd seen her the previous month, but after all, I was probably the only one who cared. Everybody else was enjoying the show and excited about the extreme upcoming meal. Dana didn't even cut the poor creature she picked. She just picked it up, put it in her mouth, wide open, as if to say, "Ready and welcome to the whole octopus." Boy, was it alive and kicking. Its tentacles started sticking out from her mouth and clung tightly to her pale face. I couldn't help but wonder how Dana would remove them all in order to swallow the animal whole all at once. Everybody knows the dangers of the tentacles getting stuck in the nasopharynx, and anyone in that situation would look and feel extremely terrified. Everybody knows the dangers of the tentacles getting stuck in the nasopharynx, and anyone in that situation would look and feel extremely terrified. But after eating the second octopus, Dana's expression started changing. Something was wrong, and it looked like she was choking. She tried swallowing really hard, shook her head, turned her neck, but it was obvious that the situation was becoming more and more critical. At some point, she gripped her own neck tightly with her two hands and fell to the ground. Comments from the thread confirmed that certain viewers had also realized that she was choking, and many of them expressed their care and concern, but there were still quite a few trolls and evil comments. Fearing the worst, I contacted Dana's relatives, called an ambulance, and immediately rushed to my best friend's house. I knocked on her door like a mad woman. I ran to the living room where she shot her videos and found Dana slumped over on her chair, unconscious, while the camera was still filming the horrific scene. And there were still hundreds of thousands of viewers who didn't lift a finger while she was choking. Some were simply too shocked and horrified to react, but others would still make idiotic comments or even say that she was paying the price for selling her soul and her palate for easy money. Karma, in other words. Even more horrifying was the scene that the medical staff and I faced when we broke into the house. The living room was filled with rubbish and bugs, food boxes, and containers scattered on the floor and on the counter surfaces. It seems that she simply never threw anything away, and the stench came from the massive quantities of rotting matters. Everywhere you looked, you would see spoiled milk and eggs, moldy baked goods, and fermenting unknown foods. Cockroaches, flies, maggots, mice, ants, you name it. All these creatures were fully at home and thriving in this otherwise nightmarish playground. Basically, Dana merely cleaned up a tiny little area for her video shoots. The ER team immediately took Dana under their care, but unfortunately it was too late. She had suffered from severe respiratory failure and was now in a persistent vegetative state. Her family hasn't pulled the plug on her yet, and I pray every day that she gets better, but I fear that she'll never recover from this dreadful episode. This YouTube thing seemed easy at first, but it put too much pressure on this young woman. Always afraid of the public opinion, and imposing revolting meals on herself on a daily basis, she was constantly criticized. And she had totally alienated her family, and she really had no one. In the end, she can only blame herself But how sad and pathetic it is. Oh well, food for thought, I guess. And I think her last meal sucked. My name is Felix. I'm a psychiatrist and have encountered a strange case that science cannot explain. When this happened in 2008, I'd been invited by a client to come to her home to evaluate her son's mental condition. The young man, then in his 20s, remained living in the family home, refusing to talk or visit with anyone. He was clearly suffering from severe autism. One particular thing, he loved to draw. In fact, he would often lock himself into his room for days at a time, or choose a secluded corner in the park only to draw pictures. Lately, he'd been showing signs of instability. He would look insecure, upset, sometimes even crazy, screaming that he was about to die. The mother had grown increasingly worried about her son's condition, and she reached out for my help in the hope that I would help him to recover. I asked for her permission to enter his room and to talk with him. Luckily, the door was unlocked, and I was able to get a slight peek inside. Pens and paint littered upon the floor, and the room was actually quite chaotic. Not what you'd expect from an art lover's haven. In one corner sat a skinny boy, painting with a blank look on his face, sometimes mumbling something incomprehensible. But before I could even step in, he began speaking to me, asking to know if I wanted to know my destiny or not. That was the very first time I had met such a patient. There was definitely something very mysterious about him. And as a psychiatrist, my first thought was that this person had indeed been suffering a mental problem, but I was curious about what he had to say. As I entered the room, he didn't scream or go crazy like his mother had told me. In fact, he proved to be extremely friendly towards me. He began holding and showing me his paintings, including a scene of a restaurant being burnt down, a traffic accident, and then numerous scenes of people being shot and killed, lying in pools of blood. The pictures also included numbers that he believed were the respective days that these events would occur. This strange guy also claimed that the scenes he drew were predictions that would happen in the future. Of course, like everyone else, I didn't believe what this young man was saying and thought he was merely showing signs of paranoia. I then left the unusual room to meet with his family and inform them that I would come back the next day to begin a mental treatment plan with him. However, the following day, and almost eerily, the famous restaurant that I would drive by every day suddenly caught fire as I passed by. I couldn't help but think that it looked so much like the boy's drawing. It was precisely this corner of the intersection. Everything was so detailed and accurate in the painting, but I'd not paid much attention until it actually happened. After witnessing the accident, I immediately drove on to meet the young man, but as I arrived, his house was closed. The neighbors said he'd gone crazy and had been rushed to the mental hospital by his parents. I hurriedly asked for the hospital's address and drove away. I usually turn on the radio every time I'm on the road to catch up on the news. On that day, a catastrophic series of shootings had occurred in a supermarket, killing many victims. What was even more strange was that everything went exactly as depicted in the boy's picture I had seen the previous day. Could he really be able to predict the future? As I arrived at the psychiatric hospital, he'd been tied to a bed. Although his body did not flinch, he would scream that he and his parents were about to die in an accident. A few hours later, the doctor concluded that his condition was too severe and that they had no sufficient means to calm him down. They recommended to the mother to move him to a better psychiatric hospital offering modern equipment and professional medical staff. His parents and the 2 hospital staff helped him to get into the car that would drive him to the downtown hospital. I joined them for the ride, but for some reason, he began fighting violently, refusing to board. Even on the way there, he kept screaming that the car should stop or all would die. His hysterical premonitions made me feel uneasy, and I suddenly remembered the picture of the accident I had seen the previous day. It was an image of a crashed ambulance following its collision with a container truck. But by the time I remembered, it was too late, and the accident had already occurred on the highway. Everyone in the car died, and I was the only survivor. Luckily, I was only injured, but nonetheless hospitalized, as both my legs were broken. Hello, my name is Iris. I'm just an ordinary taxi driver in America. I got married last year, and this year we're talking about welcoming a little angel to our home. That's why I have to work twice as hard as I did before to give my family the best things possible. That day, after driving a guest from a farm to the outskirts of the city, I was about halfway home. I saw a woman in a red shirt, holding a red umbrella and standing by the side of the road, waving at me. It looked like she was in a hurry. I pulled over and offered to give her a ride. The girl in red handed me a small piece of paper after getting into the car. It had the address and directions to where I needed to go. But the address was strange to me. Although I've been working as a taxi driver for more than 4 years, it was the first time I'd seen an address like this. Maybe it was located somewhere on the outskirts of the city. As I had expected, the navigation device told me it would take about an hour to arrive. Throughout the whole trip, that woman didn't say a single word. Everything she wanted to communicate to me was written down on papers. The atmosphere was getting colder, even though I had the air conditioner on to its minimum level. The windows were closed, but every few minutes I could feel a blast of cold air. It was spooky and made me shiver with the goosebumps. About 45 minutes into the ride, my navigation device suddenly said error. Then the woman in the red dress passed me another sheet of paper containing a small map on it and a caption saying that I needed to drive about 30 minutes more to arrive at her destination. Sometimes I glanced at her through the car mirror, but I accidentally made eye contact with her, and her eyes were staring right at me, as if she was staring at me the whole time. So I followed the instructions in the paper. I had to drive through a dark forest with the thought that we might arrive at our destination when we reached the end of the forest. But then I had to navigate a turn, and next to it was a signpost in 2 directions. It said turn left to enter town and turn right to go to the farm. Now the woman immediately raised her hand and made a sign for me to turn right, saying that this was a shortcut and that if we went this way, we would get there faster. We continued moving for another 15 minutes, and then she suddenly told me to stop the car. As soon as I got out of the car and opened the door for her, 2 freaky guys jumped out of the grove of trees as if they were about to attack me. They had guns. 2 men, one short, one fat, both wearing a mask with the shape of a bird's head, looking creepy. However, right at the moment I turned on the car's engine, One of them broke the glass with a gun and then pointed the barrel at me. I was never so afraid. With my eyes closed, I hit the accelerator pedal, jammed it to the floor as hard as I could. The other man immediately opened fire, but fortunately the bullet was going the wrong way. Seeing their prey run away, they kept honking and shooting while chasing after us for a little while longer and then stopped. After I regained my composure, I immediately called the police and reported the accident. I was hoping to find a bar or some place to rest while waiting for the police to arrive. But the scary things didn't stop there. I must have been running about 30 minutes when I recognized that old sign by an abandoned gas station. Somehow I must have been running in circles. But even more frightening, the woman with the red umbrella was still standing on the side of the road, waving at me. I immediately looked back, and she disappeared. I sighed a breath of relief. But then I looked up to find out that she had already navigated her way to the front of my car. Like a reflex action, I immediately steered the car and crashed it into a tree. I was very startled and didn't know what to think, but it was certainly scary. After that, I didn't remember anything. I just knew that the police had arrived just in time to take me and my car to the garage. But one thing amazed me. The police had arrested 2 suspects in this area who'd been living off the land growing corn and right below the sewer where I parked my car, and was robbed by bandits. The police had found the body of a young girl, and after investigating, they were able to identify that girl as Lisa. She'd gone missing, lost in this area, about a month ago. Her car died on the road, and it was raining so heavily. She brought an umbrella with her and walked for a long distance. But it was so unfortunate of her to meet these 2 bastards. The story of the girl with the red umbrella has haunted me for a long time. Whenever I'm on the street and see a girl waving at me, I get that sudden feeling of fear and dread. I just can't stop thinking, was this a ghost, an apparition of some kind? And I don't think I'll be taking any late night questionable customers ever again. Hello, it's me, Iris. I have encountered so many monstrous things that I had to buy myself a brand new car just to continue my work. One day around 8 p.m., when I was about halfway through eating a hamburger, I got a phone call from a customer of mine. I quickly picked up the phone, but strangely, on the other end of the line, no one said anything. Thinking that I was being teased by someone, I hung up. About 5 minutes later, I got another phone call from the same number. But like the previous time, on the other end of the line, no one said a word. A few moments later, I got a message. This time, the person texted me saying the signal from where they were texting me was weak, so they only attached their address to the message for me to go pick them up. Fortunately, the GPS tracking device worked fine this time. But I encountered something more dreadful than that. While I was driving on a mountain pass, which was near to the pickup point, my car suddenly stalled. No matter what I did or tried, I couldn't get it to work. Having no other choice, I had to text them back to tell them that my car was broken, hoping that they would sympathize with my situation. I informed them to text another driver to assist them. After that, I immediately called the rescue team. I sat in my car for about 20 minutes. From where I could see, many people were moving toward me. There was a thick fog outside, My night vision was very poor, but as my eyes began to acclimate to the darkness, I was able to make out some kind of shadows moving slowly in my direction, and I was cheerfully certain that it was the rescue team. But as they got closer, something strange, like the silhouette of some creatures, and I could see what appeared to be a human form, with 2 arms, 2 legs, but their posture was weirdly strange. They walked with a hunch on their backs, and they were too small to be human. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a blast of icy cold air hit me, instantly freezing my spine. I felt paralyzed from the cold. My entire body trembled uncontrollably. I quickly checked all the doors to make sure that I'd locked them, but in a panic, I realized that the passenger side window was still open. Nervously, I quickly rolled it up. Then suddenly, an arm reached in from outside. The arm gripped the door in front of me, growling and making strange vocalizations, like some kind of alien, making screeching cries. And then I realized that it was strangely similar to the cries of a monkey. Right in front of me was this long, thin arm full of fur. I panicked and began kicking it. The monkey-like creature appeared to be hurt. It forcefully yanked its arm back out of the car. In that moment, I quickly and quietly chose to protect myself by securely locking my car, hoping to remain undetected inside my little cocoon. Then there was a dreadful silence. It seemed as if all those monkey-like beasts had left. The inside car windows were all fogged up, making it almost impossible to see anything outside. Somehow, I must be able to know if those creatures are still here. I had to regain my composure, but the fear of what happened outside terrified me so deeply that I couldn't move a muscle. Now, I had to face this situation alone. I mustered up the courage and forced myself to overcome my terror. So I took a deep breath. It was now or never. But before I could do anything, I discovered strange, weird handprints on the car's misty windshield. I was so frightened. These handprints, or footprints, were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And now I could hear some kind of gibberish chatter coming from outside. It appeared that these unknown devilish monsters were still here. And, along with their screeching, it became clear to me that whatever kind of beings they were, and I was convinced that they were not here to make friends. The only thing I could do at that moment was close my eyes, cover my mouth, and nervously wait for them to leave. About 5 minutes later, everything was quiet again. I turned on the wipers to remove the mist from the front window. However, as soon as the mist was cleared, I could see dozens of monkeys gathered on the road. They were standing still. Their posturing clearly affirmed to me that these strange life forms were looking at me as if I were about to become their next meal. All of their freakish red eyes were fixed on me, as if they were collectively plotting my fate. I was still horrified when a monkey leaped forward toward my car, revealing its sharp fangs, while making wheezing sounds and drooling all over the car with the kind of foam that one might expect to see from a dog with rabies. I was praying that the rescuers would come to rescue me in time. But looking at those monkeys, I could tell that they were very hungry. Suddenly, I remembered the fried chicken thighs I bought for my wife earlier. With no other choice, I reached over to lower the window and throw them some food. Unexpectedly, my plan worked. The crispy chicken thighs immediately distracted them, and those red-eyed monsters began to lose interest in me as they slowly and gradually left me and my car in peace. However, right after that, the monkeys turned their gaze back to my car. It seemed like I made a critical error in my tactics. My actions led them to react to me as if I was harboring a staging area for more food. They came rushing at my car again. The windshield started to crack from their pounding. I could feel extreme danger approaching me. Suddenly, a great light shone directly on them, making them scatter in all directions. Luckily, the rescue team had arrived, and those monkey-looking minions saw a lot of people and immediately ran into the forest. I took my car to the garage, but the mechanics told me that my car was beyond repair and that it could no longer be serviced. My car was completely destroyed by those primates. But what frightened me even more was the picture of the car's condition from last night's assault. The entire car was covered with bizarre, sticky, human-like fingerprints, footprints, whatever. I could not tell if they were actually monkeys or if they were made from some other ape-like, scary monster. However, this was a story that haunted me and reminded me never to drive on those remote mountain passes ever again.
One full weekend, Fallon and I went wild boar hunting the mountains. We had heard of new hunting grounds that were supposed to be particularly scenic and whose wild game was incredible. It took us 5 hours by car to reach the entrance of the park, followed by a 2-hour hike to be at the specific area, which was said to have the most wild boars. On the occasion of this trip, Fallon gave me a gun as a gift. I was so glad and excited that I immediately threw it over my shoulder. It looked really cool. At the beginning of the hunting expedition, the first animal that we encountered was a deer. Yet we were so engrossed in our quest for a wild boar that we left the path to go deep inside the forest. And inevitably, we got lost. Both Fallon and I had been Boy Scouts and had the necessary orientation skills, yet it was still impossible to find our way out of the dense woods. After what felt like an eternity, we finally found a trail. At the end of the trail, our ray of hope was materializing in the form of a wooden house, presumably a former hostel or lodge that looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago. My friend and I still decided to go inside to take a break and grab a bite. Fallon then remembered the park had a research center that dated back to wartime, and we figured this was it. As we stepped inside, we discovered a large space filled with charred wood, the tile floor littered with what looked like coals and fragments of animal bones, as well as several scattered shovels. At the back of the room, a bed was nestled in a corner and was covered with a blanket, as if someone was still sleeping there. We figured this person had just left for the day and would be back any time, possibly to help us find the trail back. But before I could even drop my backpack on the floor, I heard a strange noise coming from the front door. A gray-haired, bearded old man appeared at the doorstep with a hunting rifle pointing in our direction, looking at us with fierce eyes and an angry expression. Fallon and I raised our hands in panic, and I immediately told him to stay calm, as we were lost and simply needed help. He almost interrupted me and yelled, "Tony, time to eat," before laughing hysterically and slamming the door shut behind him. We immediately heard a wild roar and the noise of an animal scratching the floor and running in place. Panic hit both of us, and we froze in terror. But in the blink of an eye, Fallon was thrown in the air, screaming his lungs out. What was happening? While I tried to make sense of this crazy situation, a monster was staring at me, growling, and its mouth was covered in blood. I could see it more clearly now, and it looked very much like a human being, but didn't fully stand up. It was very muscular, extremely hairy, and with abnormal large shoulders. The monster gained momentum before charging towards me, but he was sufficiently far that I was able to pull out my gun and quickly fire several bullets towards his chest. The beast was hit by several shots and went crazy, howling and getting much nearer. Before I could react, I was lifted into the air and pressed against the wall. The monster was squeezing my neck, and the more I struggled, the more the grip got tighter. It seemed that my shots worked, and I could feel the monster gradually losing its strength until it completely released me. It then fell backwards, panting heavily. The man had witnessed the whole scene and ran to him, hugged him tight, and cried heavily. After losing so much blood, the monster stopped breathing a few minutes later, and the frail old man was all sobs and tears, as if mourning the monster. He didn't show any sign of resistance as I tied him up and used his cell phone to call 911. While we waited for the ambulance and the police to arrive, he started explaining that the monster lying in the pool of blood was his son. Following a brief illness, his teenage son fell into a coma, with most of his organs having failed. All the best hospitals and doctors had given up, but the father wouldn't pull the plug on his son and decided to put use what he had learned from his research during the war. He traveled the world looking for organs from donors to be transplanted into his son. It took him a few years, and the process was long and tedious, with numerous medical setbacks. But one day, his son came back to life. Alive he was, but completely changed inside and outside. In other words, and despite his best intentions, the old man had turned his son into a monster. Since his resurrection, the previously polite and affable young man could only mumble and mutter grunts. He could no longer walk properly and would prefer to crawl, but more importantly, he had turned into a bloodthirsty beast who would only spare his father. The latter, aware that his son was now completely abnormal and a hazard for anyone near him, decided to move for good to the forest, far away from civilization. A short while later, as I was safely back home, I made another horrible discovery while Googling the old man. The experiments that he and his colleagues had conducted during the war gave way to the Hiroshima and Kawasaki hecatombs.
Life is unbelievably difficult for those ethnic minorities living on the Yangtze River in China. So much so that non-governmental organizations or NGOs came from all around the world to help. My name is Adele Hatter. I came from Australia as a volunteer to support these communities with so many tasks and hardships involved. A year went by, and I finally began to acclimate into their culture, their ways, and their lives. But one terrifying, macabre experience brought the entire project to an immediate halt. Everything that was new, serene, happy and beautiful suddenly became much worse. It involved Jan, a close friend of mine. We knew each other through the volunteer group. She was about the same age as me and helped her father, a local apothecary. During a hike up the mountains to pick rare plants for her father, Jan suddenly slipped, fell off a cliff, and died. I was devastated to hear about her death. My heart was broken to pieces because I just lost my best friend. At the funeral, I gathered a small bunch of her favorite wildflowers and placed them in her left hand and prayed with my eyes closed. She was lying there as if nothing happened, like nothing had changed, as if she was merely sleeping. She was such a gentle beauty, her cherry red lips a stark contrast against her snow-white, smooth complexion. About 2 days after the burial, I was working in my cabin when I heard a loud knock on the door coming from outside. I opened the door and found Jan's sister, looking so terribly sad, anxious and scared. Tears were running down her cheeks as she told me that Jan's grave had been dug up by someone and that her body was now gone. I was speechless, and chills ran up and down my spine. I was so shocked that my legs began trembling, and I almost couldn't stand on my feet any longer. But I mustered up my courage and immediately accompanied Jan's sister and a few of the other volunteers to come to the grave. When we arrived, we saw the tomb had been destroyed, most likely by a shovel. Soil and stones everywhere, and the tombstone had been knocked over, and the lid of the coffin was open, with brown stains and a few maggots. This was the saddest and most revolting scene I had ever witnessed. I never thought such things were possible, and had certainly never heard of such stories back in Australia, where the authorities would have quickly taken matters into their own hands. I felt exhausted and distraught, so I decided to go to bed early. As I'd just fallen asleep, I suddenly felt like something or somebody was summoning me. I tried to open my eyes, but I still couldn't see anything. Slowly, I could recognize Jan in a bridal dress, surrounded by a misty haze. The fabric was a beautiful crimson red, and Jan suddenly burst into tears. The sound of her crying became more and more intense, but after a while, she vanished. Was it just a dream? It all seemed so real. The rest of that night I only managed to sleep for a few hours. My mind was so full of emotions. My thoughts were scrambled. Several nights later, I dreamed of Jan again. This time, the scenery was different, and I was walking down the village's main street. I could see Jan from a distance, standing in front of a bridal shop, but as I got nearer, she disappeared again. Again on this night, I couldn't sleep. I was so nervous and began sweating profusely. That's when I realized that Jan was trying to reach out to me in my dreams. Was she trying to tell me something? The following day, I went to a nearby bridal shop as soon as it opened. After questioning the clerk, he told me that a strange visitor had been at the store. He identified that man as Pao. He was an unemployed young man who recently bought a wedding dress that cost about 200 yen. Then he came back a couple days later to buy makeup, accessories. The salesman found that a bit strange. given Pow's financial situation, but he did not question it. He was just too happy to make the sale. I immediately texted that information to Jan's sister, and we went to Pow's house together. Since I didn't know what to expect from this visit, I was impatient and terrified. I knew he'd been pursuing Jan for a long time, but she rejected him on numerous occasions. Deep down, I suspected that he was linked to the disappearance of Jan's body. We broke the door, opened it, and rushed inside. The whole house reeked, with the stench of death making us both instantly nauseous and on the verge of vomiting. We didn't think about what we were doing. We just entered each room with our noses covered, only to find Jan's body lying on a bed against the wall. Pow was hugging and lulling the corpse to sleep, and on the wall behind, a large crimson sea seemed to be blessing the macabre embrace. Just like in my dream, Jan was wearing a crimson bridal gown, but it was no longer pretty and immaculate. The whole dress was covered with a brownish, wet filth. As the rotting flesh had perspired through the fabric, critters were surrounding the decaying corpse. They were busy feasting on the shreds of skin and the various matters that had oozed out of the body orifices. Amidst the horror, Jan's beautiful face was now shriveled, and she looked even more grotesque with the heavy makeup that Pow had lovingly applied. The young man was indeed crazy in love. He couldn't acknowledge that she was dead, or that anything else he did was wrong. He even tried to convince the police that came to arrest him that she was very happy in his home, and that she would beg them to let him free. After what had happened, I could no longer live there, and I asked permission to leave the charity and return to Australia. The memory of this still haunts me today, and I know that people can really do anything for love, even the unthinkable.
Hello everyone. My name is Suki, and everybody says that I'm an adorable 8-year-old little girl. But a spirit has taken my soul and is now living in my body while I'm waiting for my prey. Please help me. Seeing all the normal people walking on the street around me makes me sad and angry. I used to be a happy little girl who had everything she could wish for, but now I'm nothing but an empty soul since this evil spirit robbed me of my happy life. Last year, my father went on a business trip and came back with a special gift for me. As we opened the door to greet him, he was holding a teddy bear that I immediately fell in love with. It was a lovely teddy bear with huge, kind eyes and a sweet smile. He then told me and my mom how he bought it. He originally intended to get it at a large department store, but he arrived too late and the doors were shut. However, on the way back home, he saw a teddy bear smiling at him from behind the window of a second-hand shop. He walked into the store and looked around, only to see a more or less 70-year-old man cleaning up a kitty litter box. The old man seemed rather uncomfortable when he looked at my dad, Dave, and asked him what he wanted. Dad then pointed to the teddy bear, saying he wanted to buy it. Surprisingly, the old man hurriedly took the teddy bear from the shop window and handed it over to my father, but he refused to tell him the price and in fact said, "I'm happy to give it to you and your daughter for free," which surprised my dad. My parents have always been busy with work. Every day after school, I would just stay in my bedroom and play with my beloved new teddy bear. I would treat it like my little brother, feed it and cuddle it to sleep. I often talked to my teddy, and we read fairy tales together. I was so happy to have this furry little brother. After a while, every night, as I turned off the lights and went to bed, it made me feel uncomfortable and scared, and I began having nightmares. And as soon as I had that feeling that the teddy bear was moving and doing things on its own, I would sometimes find it sitting on a sofa or on the dining room table. At other times, it was nestled in one of my bedroom corners. There were also other moments when I would accidentally drop it or handle it improperly, and I swear that thing would glance back at me with fire in his eyes. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they simply didn't believe me and thought I'd gotten bored with the toy and was warming up to ask them for a new one. As time went by, I also realized that I was becoming a chubby little girl. My cheeks were getting plumper, my eyes were growing larger, and even my parents and maid started noticing my weight gain. We were actually all quite happy that I was no longer frail and fragile, and even praised my maid for taking such good care of me. However, 1 or 2 days later, I woke up to find myself lying in bed, unable to move my arms and legs. After a lot of effort, I managed to stack a few sets of pillows behind my back, and as I looked at myself in the mirror of my pink dressing table, all I could see was a puzzled teddy bear. I screamed in panic and burst into tears as I realized that I was no longer a cute 8-year-old and had become a flurry plush toy. I fell down, rolled onto the floor, and saw myself coming my way. The little girl picked me up, giggling, and looked at me with an evil, murderous stare. Then she suddenly declared, "Congratulations, you are the chosen one. I've been waiting for you for so long." Having said that, she then threw me hard into a corner of the room and laughed hysterically. The maid, having heard the noises, came upstairs and witnessed the whole scene from the slightly open bedroom door. Overwhelmed and panicked, she began screaming and tried running away. But the little me was quick to react and attacked her right away. I saw her grasping the maid's dress and stabbing her viciously from behind numerous times. Legs, stomach, back, even heart and throat when she fell to the ground. No part of her body was spared. The new me dragged her down the stairs to the lobby, and I heard the body thumping on the ground from my bedroom. I sobbed all along, powerless, silently begging God for help, but he didn't hear me. When Mom and Dad got back from work, they immediately found our maid's dead body lying on the entrance floor and found me hiding in a closet with the real me as a teddy bear in her arms. My evil alter ego was in tears and told them, "Dad, Mom, that teddy bear killed the maid. Please throw it away and return it to the store. I don't like it anymore." The police later concluded that our home had been broken into by a criminal and that the housemaid was in fact his unfortunate victim. Because the new me kept crying, asking my father to bring the teddy bear back to the store, there was no way my father wouldn't oblige. as he was holding one arm clutched to his chest. I tried telling my father that I was locked up in this teddy bear body, but all my attempts were useless and unsuccessful. My father took me back to the store, and I was put back at the same place in the same window shop where the teddy bear was standing when he saw it. I cried, screamed, yelled from the top of my lungs, but my voice was muted, my tears were dry, and I still had a furry, smiley face. Dad didn't hear me and just left. The old man then picked me up and said, "Just sit there. Smile all you can and wait for your new dad." He gently placed me back in the display window at the very front, as if this was the prime position for the teddy bear, and the teddy bear only. The spirit has become me and has been enjoying my happy life ever since, well, I got stuck in this teddy bear body, and has been sitting in front of this display glass, waiting for my lucky day, waiting for my replacement and my deliverance. And the evil circle won't be ending anytime soon.
Killer crocodile on the camping trip to hell. Hello everyone, I'm Doron, your guide. Very nice to meet you. Does everyone like camping? Most people are fond of it. I also loved it too. Telling scary nighttime stories while sitting around the campfire enjoying the twinkling stars above. But let me tell you about the most horrible camping trip I ever experienced during my junior year in high school. I'll never go camping again after my weekend journey from hell. Our homeroom teacher secretly arranged a surprise weekend getaway at a pristine nature reserve where we planned to spend a night camping alongside a beautiful hidden lake surrounded by a huge, natural, untouched forest wilderness area. After a 30-minute bus ride, we arrived at our destination and were warmly greeted by our wilderness guide. Our story began with the bustling sounds of excitement while putting our tents up under a large group of shade trees. We then divided our class into 6 small groups of 4. Each group had been assigned its own small boat, and after our teacher gave us the green light to go, we all climbed aboard our tiny boat. As scheduled, we planned to row around the lake, enjoying the scenery, and then returning back for the barbecue. The groups began to paddle, following the instructions of Tony, our guide, who came with us. As we were happily talking and laughing, Tony suddenly screamed, "Crocodile!" For a split second, we thought it was a joke. But no, it was really happening. The horror spread like wildfire. Everyone immediately began rowing back in a fury of panic. I stood up on the boat, my eyes following the direction shown by Tony's finger, and there it was. I could clearly see the crocodile's evil green stare. The reptile began emerging from the water, huge and aggressive, repeatedly pushing our boat with his muzzle. It was then that our boat tipped violently. We all froze with fear, although Tony, Mark, and Alida began screaming and crying out for their lives. Our teacher yelled, urging the rest of the class to calm down and get to the shore as quickly as possible. The ferocious beast had attacked our boat, and at some point the boat capsized. Quick as lightning, the crocodile charged us. With its wide, massive open mouth and the darkness of his throat, I could see its sharp teeth and the saliva dripping from his mouth. I was so terrified, I froze, as if I were hypnotized. In a blink of an eye, it sank its jaw into Mark's left shoulder and pulled him deep into the water. A few bubbles came to the surface, followed by a red cloud of blood.
We had no doubt about Mark's fate any longer. Tony then began yelling at the rest of us to swim as fast as possible to the shore. In the extreme panic, I thought I'd seen a closer area where we could safely find refuge. Tony then confirmed to Alita to swim in that direction instead. I really believed the crocodile had gone for good, but as I was getting nearer to what I thought was our safe haven, I almost choked. On the shore in front of us lay a large group of nearly a dozen angry crocodiles, basking in the warm sun, right where we'd planned to swim to safety. As I turned around in the water to warn my friends, I could see our teacher coming to us in his boat, motioning us to swim slowly toward him as not to wake up the slumbering beasts. We managed to hold our breath and swim efficiently enough that we were almost able to climb aboard the boat. But as Tony was stepping into the boat, we heard a startled, scared A crocodile had just shot up like an arrow, with his open mouth, attempting to bite off his leg. We all screamed at once in panic. When was this nightmare going to end? Thank God, Tony had managed to keep his balance and didn't fall into the water. It turned out the monster had only bitten into his prosthetic leg. We were almost too afraid to climb aboard, so our teacher immediately suggested we swim toward the forest where no reptiles were in sight. As I saw, it was leading to the road that would bring us back to the safe shore. We swam like madmen and luckily found a ranger station nearby. They helped us to get to our base camp to reunite with the rest of the class. Just a few hours later, police and rescue teams were present at the scene, conducting a search for Mark's body. But just as we feared, all they found was Mark's torn and tattered shirt. The subsequent investigation revealed that a nearby crocodile farm had carelessly not tended to the broken fence surrounding the farm, allowing the crocodiles to escape into the lake. This was definitely the most horrible camping trip I ever experienced. This was also the last time I saw Mark, whom I shall never forget.
Hello, my name is Brian, and I'm a detective within the Chicago Police Department. In the course of my investigating career, I've encountered my share of horrific and disturbing cases. But one case in particular has been haunting me and my colleagues until now. And today I will tell you all about it. And with the exception of the police and a couple law enforcement officers, no one else ever knew about it. See, the case wasn't even disclosed to the press, given how horrifying it was. The year was 1998. I was patrolling the city when the police radio dispatcher reported that a serious accident had just occurred 2 blocks away from my location. I naturally rushed to the scene, where I saw a car had crashed into a pizza parlor around the corner. The driver had apparently lost control of the vehicle and landed in the pizza parlor. Fortunately, there was no one in the kitchen, and the driver only suffered light injuries. My colleagues and I went inside to examine the crash more closely, and that's when we stumbled upon an absolutely horrifying secret. At the scene, we discovered a severed arm lying on the ground in front of the car, surrounded by shards of broken glass. Upon seeing this, the pizza parlor owner next to us immediately turned pale and fell to the floor. Something didn't click with the owner, and my guts were telling me there was something suspicious about him. I casually asked to have a look around the kitchen, and after a brief hesitation at first, he allowed us to carry out our mission. We were quite thorough in our search, and after a while, I began to wonder whether we would find anything that would help us with our investigation. But then, I saw the freezer had been partially hit open by the car, and I immediately got the feeling that this was where the severed limb was coming from. In fact, it was mostly filled with ham, bacon, crab sticks, etc. The usual suspects when it comes to a pizzeria. But as I got closer, I discovered that there were two larger freezers hidden behind it. I began moving the bacon boxes, and there it was. The most horrific, disturbing, and nauseating sight ever. A messy heap of human limbs and heads that had been violently cut and ripped apart before being thrown into this trash bag. I could still clearly identify a chunk of flesh presumably removed from a large pelvis. We continued taking a look around and found another trash bag, this one filled with balls of tangled hair, and from the look of them, the nails were pulled off. This made me realize that we would find at least 2 corpses in this kitchen. Still in shock and sick to our guts, we turned around as the owner started confessing to his revolting murders in a monotonous, detached voice. He explained without flinching that he was using human meat instead of pork to make his highly popular gourmet pizzas. The owner also added that the 2 bodies lying at the bottom of the freezer were those of 2 security patrol officers. Following a personal conflict, he said he had accidentally killed both of them in a heated argument and figured out that the easiest way to cover up his crime and get rid of the bodies was to turn the flesh into pizza meat toppings. To think that hundreds of happy customers, including me, had raved about his fabulous and delicious pies. If only they knew their unique flavor came from human flesh. How revolting and disgusting. I can't help but shiver and feel nauseous. We thought our case was closed and brought the owner to trial. But while in court, his son screamed and hysterically jumped out of his seat crying and ran toward the judge to confess. He explained that he was the one who had killed the 2 men, who were in fact thugs that racketed him. They had made him give away his pocket money on a daily basis in exchange for not being molested. One day, he had no money to give them and was beaten up badly. His father had witnessed the scene from the back of the parlor. As he was going towards them to the end of the beating, he suddenly saw his son pulling out a long knife and stabbing the 2 bullies in the chest, filled with rage and anger. He was quick to hit them precisely, so much that both of them immediately collapsed and died soon after in a pool of blood. Having watched the horrific scene, the father was at first both panicked and petrified. But after a couple of minutes of shock, he instinctively ran toward the dead bodies and dragged them into the kitchen, out of anyone else's sight. He was also quick to clean up the bloody, incriminating murder scene. To cover up for his son and dispose of the bodies, he dismembered the corpses and stored them in a freezer, which he began using as his special pizza secret ingredients. If the car had not crashed into the parlor, This secret would most likely have been buried forever, and his secret recipe still causing a sensation and much speculation. I still cannot get over that horrific case and don't think I ever will. Oh, and I don't eat pizza anymore.
I just received word that my father's gone missing for more than a week. Until his disappearance, he'd been working as a supermarket manager in a remote small town in Japan. In a recent email, he told me a creepy story while advising me that in the event of his disappearance, or if anything happened to him, I should not start looking for him and protect myself. His tale was about a scary creature he'd encountered as a young man in Japan. 20 years ago, my father was still a graduate student and living away from his parents' home. In order to make ends meet, he used to work part-time at a local supermarket. Because the rental price of the studio he was living in was quite high, he decided to move to a cheaper room located in a quiet part of town. Sometimes my father would work rather late, and one evening, a little past 11 o'clock at night, he left the store, absolutely famished, and decided to look for a place to eat before going home, where he knew his fridge and cupboard were empty. He finally found the noodle shop and decided to enjoy a steaming hot bowl of rich paitan ramen. As he looked around the stall, he was surprised to see that it was devoid of any customer. Were the noodles that bad? After all, it wasn't that late. The owner was sternly standing behind the counter, his face covered by a mask and glasses, and a flat hat on the top of his head. At first, my father thought what an eccentric man he was, unless he had some kind of a deformity on his face and hides it so as not to frighten the customers away. My father was ravenous and excitedly ordered a bowl of paitan ramen with all the trimmings. After a short while, the owner stepped from behind the counter with a piping hot bowl of incredibly delicious noodles. How could this simple, nondescript noodle shop in this secluded neighborhood offer such delicacies? Greedily and happily slurping his noodles, my father thought how lucky he'd been to find this absolute culinary gem, and was all the more surprised to be the only diner. Suddenly, the shopkeeper pulled a sign down saying closed, right in front of my father, without uttering a single word. He then rushed behind the counter and began cleaning up the dishes, pans, and other likes. My father saw that and finished up his meal quickly before paying and thanking him. The owner accepted the money without saying anything. The following days, every night after work, my famished father would stop by to satisfy his hunger with the different varieties of delicious ramen available. Each time, the owner would wear the same kitchen whites, the same face mask, and the same hat. He would not utter a single word, remained expressionless, and would stare at my father eating until he would pull down his closed sign and accept his money without a nod or even a thank you. In fact, my father had many times hoped to strike up conversation since there were no other customers to accommodate, but to no avail. One evening, my father thought of going with friends for dinner after work. He invited his best friend from work to come over to the shop to eat the delicious noodles. Both excitedly walked up the alley in anticipation of the delightful meal. But when they arrived, the noodle stall was nowhere to be found. Where and why had it disappeared? My father scratched his head in confusion and embarrassment. Why is it that the stall is open every day except when he comes with friends?
My father looked around and didn't know what to say, but his friend took no umbrage nor offense and suggested that they come back another time. However, my father felt bad about this awkward event. He soon noticed that every time he'd go alone, the noodle truck was there open, whereas when he'd go with his friend, the stall would be closed or absent. He repeatedly asked the noodle man as to why he would be closed on these specific days, but each time his questions were met with a creepy silence. Feeling like he'd become an object of too much attention, my father stopped going to the noodle shop after work and started leaving work earlier or walking home using a different itinerary. But no matter what, he still encountered the cart on his way. My father had figured out that the noodle man was peculiar and probably had a troubled history. He decided to learn more about him, and he was shocked at what he found out. Yet he still didn't believe it and wanted to see the truth for himself. A few days later, he deliberately left work late and walked up the usual alley to meet the street vendor. Even though he was shivering deep down, his heart beating wildly, my father still managed to keep his composure and walked up to the owner. He pointed at a bowl of shiro ramen and asked him to add more vegetables and meat. He looked over the counter to pick up the bowl, but suddenly screamed that it was filled with large, fat worms. Upon hearing so, the owner immediately bent down to look at the bowl of noodles. Taking that opportunity, my father violently pulled away the mask from the man's face, immediately exposing his shocking and staggering physiology. His face was flat without contours. His skin was smooth and taut. He had neither eyes nor hair and was all the more frightening. My father just had a confirmation of what he feared all along. The man was, in fact, the faceless ghost. Legend has it that whenever a faceless ghost preys on someone, it will appear at any time and won't let that person go. It'll follow the victim wherever they go and constantly appear on their path until they die. My father did manage to escape then. However, the spirit warned him that he would return every 20 years until he was found. This year marks the 20th anniversary of this cryptic story. My father wanted me to be psychologically prepared in the event of his disappearance. But my gut was telling me that something was terribly wrong. It all began to feel so real. Could some outrageous, cryptic horror story really be true? It's been a week now, and I feel that I have to do something quickly. I flew to Japan searching for my father. Upon arriving at the address I was given, I knocked on the door, but no one immediately answered. Then I banged harder on the door. I could hear the sound of my father's warm voice greeting me. His voice grew louder as he neared the door, but oddly, no other sounds could be heard, not even the sound of his footsteps. After a minute or two, the old wooden door began to slowly open with the squeaking sound of the hinges. Then, upon entering, I began looking around. None of the lights or electrical appliances seemed to work. The only light I had was coming from the dim light of a flickering candle burning at the far end of the hallway. Then I saw a pile of my father's clothes in a heap on the floor in a dark corner, as though he'd just stepped out of them and completely vanished right where he was standing. All that remained was a straw hat next to his clothes and a battery-powered cassette player with my father's voice. It must have been programmed to turn on automatically from the vibration of my pounding on the door. Then, out of thin air, I heard a different voice, not human sounding. I felt the presence of some spirit evil creature who began saying in a demonic voice, "You should not have come here. Welcome to your nightmare." Afterwards, the police conducted an investigation. They followed the trail left from my cell phone. After arriving, the police reported finding 2 cell phones and 2 piles of clothes. After the investigation, news sources reported 2 missing people who'd never been seen again, along with a letter that warned, "There is real evil in this world. Be careful when these doors are opened. Your nightmares become a reality." Hello, my name is George, and I live in Cambridge with my wife and children. I'm one of the few professional hunters around here. The county forest is quite dangerous and only a few people actually venture into the woods. A few years ago, there were still many animals in the forest, and we would often bring home 3 or 4 rabbits or even a boar after a single day of hunting. Then we slowly started seeing less and less of them, and we assumed that most of them had gone deeper into the forest to seek shelter. But going so far into the forest is really dangerous. For that reason, I came up with an idea to both safely and efficiently hunt more animals again. I spent quite a lot of money on cameras that I installed in various areas of the forest in order to see where the animals tend to gather and stay. I then set up traps in designated spaces so that I could still make nice catches while staying at home. And since only a few people go into the forest, there was no need to worry about accidentally hurting people. Besides, I monitored the cameras diligently every day in case something unexpected were to happen. My genius method rapidly became quite successful, and in less than a week, I caught a couple of pheasants, hogs, and hares thanks to my traps. My workload also became much lighter. All I had to do was go to the forest early in the morning to harvest the bounty from the previous night and to replace the used traps. By mid-morning, I was home for the day, sipping a cup of tea while watching the cameras. But monitoring the screens soon became a nightmare. One evening, after dinner, and as usual, I sat at my desk with a cup of Earl Grey and logged into the video monitoring system to see if my traps had been effective. However, something unusual caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a deer, but when I looked more closely at the screen, I realized in panic that a little girl in a white dress was standing next to the trap that I had set earlier. How could an adult let a child get lost in the woods so late at night? What parent would do that? Afraid that she would severely injure herself with the trap, I hurriedly put on my coat and ran into the forest. But strangely, when I arrived, nothing was standing next to the trap. She was nowhere to be found. Still, in a state of bewilderment, I suddenly heard a small child giggling in the bushes in front of me. Thinking that she was hiding there, I dove into the shrubs, pushing the branches to the side to try to find her, but I stepped back in horror when I discovered a child's sandal covered with mud and still no little girl around. My whole body started shaking uncontrollably. Sweat was trickling down my forehead and temples. I tried to reassure myself that I had dreamt of seeing that child and quickly turned around to rush back home. That night, I couldn't get any sleep. I got out of bed at 3 a.m. and returned to my desk to check the cameras, but there she was again. The same little girl was still playing alone next to the big tree and the trap. Because it was dark, the image was quite blurry. She looked like she had no legs, and a part of her right arm was blurred as well. I got closer to the screen, hoping to recognize the little girl, but she suddenly turned her head towards the camera and stared at the monitor with big gray eyes. I immediately turned the cameras off and went back to bed right away, trying to convince myself I was having visions because I was sleep deprived. The following morning, I took the video footage to the police station in order to find out who that little girl was, but the police officer in charge just shook his head. He didn't recognize her, and no missing child profile in the past 2 years matched her description. I began wondering if it was a prank or if she came from another part of the country. Following my visit to the station, my creepy video of the strange little girl became the talk of the town. Reporters from national television even got interested in the case. And then, a few villagers recalled an event that happened 10 years ago. A little girl about the same age as the one on the camera had been hit by a train while spending the afternoon in the forest with her family. Could this be a coincidence? Everyone immediately started speculating that the little girl on the camera was none other than the spirit of the deceased child. Something didn't seem right, so I shared this story with the press in the hope of finding out the truth. A month later, a man named Jack Wilson contacted me to tell me that the little girl from the picture was not a ghost, but it was his granddaughter, little Heather, now 9 years old. He and Heather had just stayed for the holidays at a hotel just outside of town. One night, he woke up and realized that she was no longer in her bed. He began looking for her everywhere and even searched the nearby woods. He found her sleeping next to a big tree and was also where the camera was located. It seemed that the little girl had been sleepwalking into the forest and accidentally entered the camera angle. But when I asked Heather about the sandal she lost and the giggle I heard, she just shook her head and looked at me with those big gray eyes, saying she didn't remember anything. Could this be another case of a ghost who's really dead but doesn't know he's passed, still lingering? Or is this another case of some legend? You decide.
Do you believe that there are actual spirits of animals existing in this world? Let me tell you a spooky and bizarre story. My house was near the neighborhood's parking lot. One day, I heard a chilling, creepy cat growl in front of my house. I turned on the security camera to check it out and discovered something extremely eerie. I also did not expect the video to become the topic of discussion in the whole neighborhood. It even went viral on the internet. That day, as usual, when I finished having dinner, I would regularly check the camera before going to sleep. Everything was completely normal until the moment I saw my neighbor's cat named Topsy appeared on the screen. I was surprised to see a shadow of another cat following behind it. There was clearly no cat shadow appearing on the first part of the road before it suddenly appeared when Topsy passed a black car. It was definitely not Topsy's reflection, since the strange shadow of a cat was completely separate and incompatible to Topsy's. At first, I just thought that this mysterious cat shadow could have been some kind of scientific phenomenon, but after a restless night, I decided to show my neighbors, the owners of the white cat Topsy, this bizarre video. My neighbors immediately started panicking, watching it, and told me that besides Topsy, they also had another cat named Lily, but unfortunately, Lily had passed away only 3 days ago. Topsy and Lily were once extremely close. They always played together and was considered to be best friends. But ever since Lily died, Topsy was not playing anymore and showed signs of fatigue and depression. Lately, Topsy started going out at night and would not return back home until early the next morning. Unfortunately, while my son was chatting with his friends on social media, he leaked the video that was cut from the security camera. The video quickly went viral on Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. There were even a few tabloids that wrote stories about this mysterious cat ghost. My whole neighborhood began to stir. Rumors started flying around about the cat ghost in the parking lot. It had not only become a hot topic of discussion in my neighborhood, the mysterious video also received a lot of mixed comments from internet users coming from all over the world. Some people did not fall for this story of a ghost cat existing in real life, saying it was just a visual effect or a strange coincidence. However, some believed that it was completely possible to happen in real life. One internet user said that all creatures had a soul and thus believed that it was Lily's that had passed away. My neighbors were freaking out, so they went to their backyard garden to pray where they had buried Lily. They discovered that something strange had happened there at the small area of land where they had buried Lily. A part of the ground was opened up. They decided to dig a little deeper and got filled with fear when Lily's body was nowhere to be found. At that moment, unbeknownst to them, their daughter was standing behind them watching all of this. Seeing her parents turn around, looking at her, she ran up to her room as if she was trying to hide something. The couple noticed their child's strange behavior and followed her to her bedroom. But the daughter ran inside and quickly locked the door. No matter what the couple said to her, the little girl refused to open the door. With no other choice, her mother ran downstairs to find the key. When they opened the door, the little girl started screaming fearfully, crying and begging her parents to leave the room as she was curled up in a corner, holding a dirty cloth wrapped up in her hands. It took the neighbor and his wife over an hour to calm their daughter. As soon as she was calm and more relaxed, her mother approached and hugged her tight, comforting her daughter. The father carefully took the dirty cloth that was wrapped up from his daughter, foul smell filling the room. He was shocked when he saw that inside the cloth was the decomposing corpse of Lily, the dead cat. It turned out that the little girl was so upset by the death of her beloved cat, she secretly dug up the body of Lily and hid it in her room. Her parents did not know any of this and admitted that they were too occupied and careless to pay attention to their daughter's feelings, which led her to act like that. Father quickly buried the cat in another corner of the garden and prayed for Lily. The video of the ghost cat is still circulating the web and being talked about. No definite conclusion has been made, however, I believe there are many strange things existing in our world that cannot be explained by science.
My work is so intensive and demanding, make me feel so uncomfortable and tired that my brain is just crying out to find a comfortable place to lay my head down. But this was a special 2-year anniversary of my relationship, so I chose a store on Baker Street to buy my girlfriend a present. It was about 8:30 in the evening. I felt I was going to be late for my appointment, so I had to rush to make it there on time. I walked briskly through the crowds of people on the sidewalk to the bakery. The icy air from the snow made me shiver, and I tried to keep my hands deep in my pockets so I wouldn't freeze. As I walked out of the store, the pasta gradually started to cool off. I made my way along the sidewalk with a food parcel in my hand to a nearby subway station. And suddenly, a boy ran up to me with a sad, pitiful look on his face. It made me feel dumbfounded. As I was about to approach him, he suddenly grabbed the food parcel in my hand and ran into another direction. I tried my best to chase after him. I had to get that food back because I knew there was no time to wait for a second pasta. I chased the boy through several paths, then ended up in a small alley. It was a dead end with no way out. What surprised me about this alley, it was that there were countless cats and dogs wandering around. Suddenly, the boy stopped and turned to gaze toward me with a mysterious smile, if you know what I mean. I immediately knew that something was wrong, and when I turned my head to look, I saw 2 ferocious-looking thugs approaching us. One with a tall, large figure, and the other looking rather small. The big one smirked and said, "Boy, give us the bag of money and we'll let you go. Hurry up!" I watched at every one of them in panic, not understanding what was going on. And that's when he suddenly punched me in the face, which made me feel dizzy. I touched my face and glanced at them. I didn't even realize I had blood on my hand. I furiously looked at them and began screaming, causing the whole group of wild cats to run away and panic. Since this place was completely deserted, no one noticed us. And in that moment, a terrifying demon appeared in front of me. In the darkness of the alley, the figure of the devil unconsciously stuck in my mind. It had an extremely large figure. Its gnarled appearance made me feel terrified. In particular, his red eyes looked very intently at me, as if he wanted to devour me on the spot. But then he laughed horrifyingly. In panic, I took a few steps back. The thug next to me looked at me with confusion, and his eyes were ebony black, and they stared at me. And then he turned his gaze on his brother. I was petrified and felt like my soul had left my body. My limbs trembled, and I was unable to speak. I nervously watched the thugs as one of them shouted, "Demon, demon, someone please help." But the small thug blankly stared at me with a mysterious, evil smile. It amazed me that he was not afraid of the devil standing in front of me. Or was I the only person who was seeing it? I anxiously started asking for his help, but it failed. This demon in front of me had sharp, bony hands and fearsome fangs. It slowly approached us and left out a scream of horror. There was no way out for me to escape. With the devil in front of me and those aggressive thugs at my back, it seemed like everyone was trying to prevent me from escaping. At that moment, suddenly, I heard a voice. It whispered in my ear, urging me to kill the devil and run away. At first, I didn't notice it because I was so scared, and the voice kept repeating in my ears, making me crazy, and extreme anxiety filled my head. I held my head in pain, angrily looking for the demons, and I quickly turned my body to grab a long iron beside the landfill and vigorously beat the demon back and forth to kill it and destroy my fear. The more I feared, the harder I hit it, revealing the strength and courage I didn't know I had in my body. Although the devil did try to attack me, it ended up being knocked down on the spot, with blood flowing all over the ground. I turned and looked at the little ruffian in horror. His face turned pale, and then he quickly ran away from the alley, leaving me on my own, fighting my own fear. Okay, seeing the demon lying on the ground, I quickly threw the iron aside and ran out of the alley. Right now, I'm in the hospital with that nasty little thug. He is so crazy, as he dared to say, "I'm the devil." It seems like he's so obsessed that he's going insane and has now ended up being tied up on the bed by the doctor while I'm being moved to a separate room